Now, since this is an intro course to ASP.NET, I want to basically kind of go through the config file real quickly and show you the different sections that are out there or that can be out there that you can make settings in to change configurations on your web applications. Now, some of these I'll stop and explain, and some of them I'm just going to kind of blow past and just mention because it's going to be a little bit more involved, and I don't want to go too deep here. First of all, there's the trace section. And this is where we set up page and application tracing, and these aren't in any particular order. That's not the order they're in the file. There's a globalization section that we use to set character encoding. And if you've ever had to use a different character encoding set and so forth, you'll know what that is. HTTP runtime configuration. This is where we set the timeout for the execution of this particular web page. And we can also set a maximum request size if we'd like to. Compilation section handles the default language. We actually looked at that one in the previous video as we were looking inside that XML file. It also specifies assemblies available in the app. Now, we haven't talked about assemblies. These are the building blocks of a .NET framework application. These are analogous to DLLs in previous versions. They actually are still DLLs. They're just not registered in the registry the way the old ones were. But we can determine which particular pieces of code are available to this app, and we can build it into the config section. And it can tell us whether the page should be compiled in debug mode or not. There's a pages section that controls page buffering. We haven't talked about page buffering yet. It also controls session state and then view state. There's a custom errors section that determines how error information is displayed when errors occur. Authentication section, we're going to talk about that shortly when we talk about some of the security settings we need to be concerned with. And this is where we set the authentication mode for this particular web page or web application. Identity, this supports user impersonation. Now, user impersonation was beefed up in ASP.NET, and it allows the web application to impersonate a user when it makes a request, say, to SQL Server or to some other data source, and it does a really fine job. Authorization, this is where we specify what users and roles. If you're familiar with the concept of groups, then roles are basically the same thing. We're going to create a role, make people members of that role, and then give that role certain permissions. And that's really the way the Microsoft suggests you handle it. But that's where we specify those. The machine key section is where we set or configure standard encryption key between multiple web servers. And this is an advanced security technique. Just know that it's out there. You may want to go look at it. Trust, we set security policy settings. Security policies come through the Windows 2000 environment, and we can set some things there. Security policy, this is the list of available security policies for this web application. Session state, we talked about this one earlier in a previous video when we were talking about maintaining state between visits, between web page calls for a user, and we can set the type of session state to be utilized. HTTP handlers, this associates a handler with a page path and request verb. We're not going to get into all that right now. HTTP modules, this lists the modules involved in page request. Process model will configure the process model settings on Internet Information Server. Web controls, now this is something that I want to mention here. If you remember when we talked about web controls, I talked about how if I drop a web control into a web form, then every time that page or that web page is requested by a client, the web control actually recognizes the headers that requested it, and it checks to see the version and type of browser that asked for it, and it renders itself an HTML version that will work in that browser. Now, one of the things it does too is it writes information back to that browser in JavaScript if that client will support JavaScript, and it's going to be more efficient to handle any kind of client-side manipulation as opposed to server-side. And I mentioned that that is written in JavaScript, and this is where the JavaScript client-side library resides. And so if you ever have trouble, if you ever try to use web controls and you get an error message about JavaScript modules, this is where you need to come, because web controls is what points it to where that library is. Client target, this lists valid values for the client target property. Browser caps, this is the capabilities and information on various browsers. When it gets header information in, it compares that header information to what's in this section to determine what kind of a browser is out there. And keep in mind, these things are changing constantly, so you may want to come in and tweak this thing every once in a while. Web services, this is where we have configuration information for web services. These things are red hot. We'll actually take a look at them a little later. But web services are taking the world by storm, and web services are so cool in .NET and Visual Studio, you just won't believe it. So these are the configuration settings you can set. And I hope, I don't expect you to remember all of those, but I hope one or two stuck out in your mind. And you really need to be familiar with these, because a lot of times you'll have issues pop up where you need to change things. And anything you can change in the configuration setting is going to be actually easier than setting these things inside your application. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about in the next video.